The streetlights of downtown Portland cast long shadows across the cracked pavement as Michael Chen adjusted the weight of his 7-year-old daughter on his back. Sophie's small arms hung loosely around his neck, her breathing steady and peaceful despite the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Her pink backpack, stuffed with everything they owned that mattered, pressed against his spine with each step he took down the empty avenue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Michael's work boots, worn thin from years of construction sites and late-night shifts, scraped against the concrete with a rhythm that had become his meditation. One step, another step. Keep moving forward. The neon glow from the 24-hour diner ahead promised warmth, but he knew they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Not when they still had 3 miles to go before reaching the shelter that might have space for the night. From the climate-controlled interior of her black Mercedes, Victoria Lawson watched the man through tinted windows as her driver navigated the late-evening traffic. She had been returning from another board meeting that ran past midnight, the kind where million-dollar decisions were made over catered sushi and mineral water. Her phone buzzed with quarterly reports and acquisition proposals, but something about the figure on the sidewalk made her look up from the screen. The man moved with purpose despite the obvious burden. His daughter's small frame seemed weightless against his broad shoulders, and there was something in his posture that spoke of determination rather than desperation. Victoria had seen plenty of both in her 15 years climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian Industries, but this was different. This man wasn't asking for help. He was simply doing what needed to be done. The morning had started like any other Tuesday for Michael Chen. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. in the cramped studio apartment he shared with Sophie on Burnside Street. The building had seen better decades, with radiators that clanged through the night and windows that never quite closed properly. But it was home. More importantly, it was what he could afford on his salary as a maintenance supervisor at Providence Medical Center. Michael rolled out of the narrow bed and padded quietly across the worn linoleum floor to where Sophie slept, curled up on the pull-out couch. Her dark hair fanned across the pillow that had been his mother's, one of the few things he'd managed to keep after the foreclosure 2 years ago. Sophie clutched a small stuffed elephant named Mr. Peanuts. Its grey fabric faded from countless washings and countless nights of providing comfort when words weren't enough. He made coffee in the ancient percolator that sputtered and hissed, but never failed to produce the bitter fuel he needed to start each day. Through the kitchen window, he could see the Willamette River in the distance, its surface catching the early morning light like scattered coins. Someday, he promised himself as he did every morning, someday they'd live somewhere with a view like that. Somewhere Sophie could have her own room and a yard where she could play without worrying about broken glass or needles hidden in the grass. The shower water ran lukewarm at best, but Michael had learned to be grateful for what worked. He dressed quickly in his hospital maintenance uniform, the navy blue shirt with his name embroidered above the pocket and matching pants that had been pressed the night before. Appearances mattered, even when you were the guy who fixed broken air conditioning units and unclogged drains. Especially then. Sophie stirred as he moved around the small space, her eyes fluttering open with the confused sweetness of a child pulled from dreams. She sat up slowly. Mr. Peanuts still clutched against her chest and gave him the sleepy smile that made every early morning worth it. "Morning, sunshine," Michael said, settling down beside her on the couch. "Ready for another adventure?" Sophie nodded, though adventure in their world usually meant something had gone wrong somewhere else. She was used to being flexible, to plans changing without warning, to making the best of situations that adults found stressful. At 7 years old, she had already learned resilience in ways that broke Michael's heart and made him proud in equal measure. He helped her get dressed in the purple dress she'd picked out the night before, the one with tiny flowers that reminded her of the garden they'd had at their old house. The house before everything changed, before Sarah got sick, before the medical bills started arriving like storms, relentless and devastating. Before the life insurance policy turned out to have a clause that voided coverage for her specific condition. Before Michael learned that love wasn't always enough to protect the people you cared about most. They shared a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, Sophie chattering about the book her teacher had read to the class about a mouse who wanted to be a ballerina. Michael listened with the attention of someone who knew these moments were precious, who had learned not to take ordinary mornings for granted. He helped her pack her school lunch in the insulated bag that had been a splurge but was worth every penny when it meant she could eat something that tasted good. The walk to Woodstock Elementary took 20 minutes, long enough for Sophie to point out every dog they passed and to collect 3 interesting rocks for her collection. Michael carried her backpack and listened to her plans for the art project she was working on, a collage about families that would be displayed in the school hallway for parent night. He made a mental note to ask his supervisor if he could leave work early that Thursday. Sophie had been looking forward to showing him her artwork for weeks. The school building was a cheerful yellow brick structure with playground equipment that actually worked, and teachers who remembered every student's name. Michael had specifically chosen this apartment, despite the higher rent, because it was in the boundary for this school. Sophie deserved teachers who cared and classmates whose parents volunteered for field trips. She deserved normal, even if the rest of their life was held together with determination and prayer. "See you after work, kiddo," Michael said, giving her a hug that lingered just long enough to recharge his batteries for the day ahead. Sophie waved from the classroom doorway, Mr. Peanuts tucked safely in her backpack where he would wait patiently until she needed him again. The bus ride to the medical center gave Michael 30 minutes to mentally prepare for whatever crisis awaited him. His supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, was a fair woman who understood that equipment broke down at the worst possible times and that Michael was the guy who could make it work again. He'd been fixing things since he was 12 years old, starting with the lawnmower that his father couldn't afford to replace and progressing to increasingly complex mechanical and electrical systems. What Janet didn't know, what nobody at the hospital knew, was that Michael's ability to diagnose and repair complex systems came from 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. 8 years of keeping critical infrastructure running in places where failure meant people died. 8 years of improvising solutions with whatever materials were available and making equipment last longer than it was designed to. 8 years of learning that the difference between giving up and pushing through was often measured in lives saved or lost. He'd left the military when Sophie was born, unwilling to risk deployments that would take him away from his new daughter. Sarah had supported the decision, even though it meant taking a significant pay cut and starting over in civilian maintenance work. They'd been happy then, building a life together in the house with the garden where Sophie took her first steps. The house they'd lost when Sarah's medical bills consumed their savings, and then their credit, and finally their hope. The medical center buzzed with its usual controlled chaos as Michael clocked in and checked his assignment board. Room 314's air conditioning had failed during the night. The MRI machine in radiology was making an unusual humming sound that had the technicians worried. The backup generator in the East Wing needed its monthly maintenance check. All routine problems that required non-routine solutions. The kind of work that had trained him to see systems as interconnected puzzles rather than isolated components. He started with the air conditioning, climbing into the narrow crawl space above the ceiling tiles with his tool bag and a small flashlight. The problem was immediately obvious to someone who understood how these systems worked under stress. A worn belt had snapped, but the real issue was the mounting bracket that had shifted over time, creating the stress that caused the belt to fail. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A temporary fix would get the room cool again within an hour. A permanent solution would require ordering parts and scheduling downtime. but Michael could jury-rig something that would last until the proper repairs could be made. While he worked, he listened to the sounds of the hospital around him, conversations between nurses about patient care, doctors discussing treatment options, the quiet beeping of monitors that meant someone was alive and fighting. This place saved lives every day, and Michael took pride in keeping the infrastructure running that made those saves possible. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered in ways that most people never considered. The MRI machine required a different kind of investigation. Michael spent 40 minutes listening to the unusual sound, tracing power connections and checking calibration settings before discovering that a cooling fan had developed a slight wobble. The wobble created vibrations that resonated through the machine's housing, amplifying a barely noticeable sound into something that concerned the operators. A new fan would cost $300 and take a week to arrive. A strategically placed rubber washer cost 12 cents and fixed the problem immediately. By lunchtime, Michael had solved 4 different technical problems and prevented 2 potential equipment failures through careful observation and preventive maintenance. He ate his sandwich in the small break room, listening to his co-workers discuss weekend plans and vacation destinations that might as well have been on different planets. He didn't resent their conversations. Everyone deserved dreams and the means to pursue them. He just had different priorities right now. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie's teacher. "Sophie did wonderfully on her math test today. She wanted you to know right away." Michael smiled as he typed back a response full of praise and proud parent emojis. These little victories meant everything. Sophie was thriving despite their circumstances, proving every day that she had inherited her mother's resilience along with her smile. The afternoon brought a more complex challenge when the elevator in the North Tower started making grinding noises between the 3rd and 4th floors. Elevator repairs required certified technicians, but Michael could at least diagnose the problem and determine whether it was safe to keep running until the repair company arrived. He spent an hour tracing the mechanical systems, checking safety features and testing the emergency protocols. What he found concerned him. The grinding noise was coming from worn brake pads in the safety system, the backup mechanism that would stop the elevator if the main cables failed. The elevator was still safe to operate, but the margin for error was narrowing. This wasn't something that could wait for a convenient maintenance window. People's lives depended on that safety system working perfectly. Michael called the repair company and used his knowledge of the system to expedite the service call. He also quietly recommended to the facility manager that the elevator be taken out of service until the repairs were completed. It was the kind of decision that required putting patient safety ahead of convenience, the kind of judgment call that separated competent maintenance workers from truly skilled engineers. As his shift ended, Michael felt the familiar satisfaction of problems solved and systems restored. He'd kept critical equipment running, prevented potential disasters, and maintained the infrastructure that allowed doctors and nurses to focus on what they did best. It was meaningful work, even if it didn't pay enough to afford a bigger apartment or a more reliable car. The bus ride back to Sophie's school gave him time to decompress and shift gears from technical problem solver to devoted father. Sophie would want to hear about his day, and he would listen to every detail of hers. They would walk home together, stopping at the small market where Mrs. Kim always had a piece of candy for Sophie and a kind word for Michael. They would make dinner together in their tiny kitchen, Sophie standing on the step stool he'd built so she could reach the counter. It was a good life, even if it wasn't the life he'd planned. Sophie was healthy and happy. They had a roof over their heads and food on the table. Michael had work that used his skills and served a purpose larger than himself. Many people had less. Many people had more. But Michael had learned that happiness wasn't measured by what you owned, but by who you loved and how well you took care of them. The school playground was still busy with after-school activities when Michael arrived. Sophie was at the art table with 3 other children, working on what appeared to be a collaborative mural about their neighborhood. She looked up when she saw him approaching, and her face lit up with the pure joy that children reserve for their favorite people. "Daddy, look what we made!" Sophie pointed to a section of the mural that featured a small apartment building with flowers in the windows. "That's our house, and I drew Mr. Peanuts looking out the window because he waits for us to come home." Michael studied the artwork with the serious attention it deserved. Sophie had captured something essential about their life together, the way love could make even small spaces feel like home, the way patience and care could create beauty in unexpected places, the way hope could bloom like flowers in windows, brightening the view for everyone who took the time to notice. "It's perfect," he told her, and meant it completely. "Should we head home and see if Mr. Peanuts is still waiting for us?" Sophie gathered her art supplies and tucked her latest creation carefully into her backpack. She took Michael's hand as they walked toward the school exit, chattering about the spelling test tomorrow and the field trip next week to the Science Museum. Michael listened and responded appropriately, but part of his attention was already shifting to the evening routine ahead. Dinner to prepare, homework to supervise, bath time and story time, and the 100 small tasks that made up the architecture of single parenthood. What neither of them knew as they walked home together was that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. That sometimes the most important moments in life arrive without warning, disguised as problems that need to be solved or distances that need to be covered. That sometimes the measure of a person's character isn't found in their resume or their bank account, but in what they're willing to carry and how far they're willing to go when someone they love is depending on them. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Burnside Street as Michael and Sophie made their way home, two figures among thousands in a city full of stories. But some stories have the power to change everything that comes after, and this was about to become one of them. The emergency began at 3:17 p.m. on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Michael was replacing a faulty thermostat in the pediatric wing when his radio crackled to life with Janet's voice, strained and urgent in a way he'd never heard before. "Michael, I need you in the main lobby immediately. We have a situation." He secured his tools and made his way quickly through the hospital corridors, past nurses moving with increased urgency and security guards speaking quietly into their radios. The main lobby, usually filled with the controlled bustle of visitors and staff, had transformed into something resembling a command center. Janet stood near the information desk with Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the hospital's emergency coordinator, both of them studying a tablet with grave expressions. "What's the situation?" Michael asked, approaching the group. Dr. Hernandez looked up, her face pale beneath her silver hair. "We've got a massive water main break on Hawthorne Boulevard. The city's shut down all traffic in a 6-block radius, and it's created a transportation nightmare. Parents can't get to the elementary schools for pickup. Emergency services are overwhelmed, and we're looking at hundreds of stranded children." Michael felt his stomach drop. "Woodstock Elementary. Right in the affected zone," Janet confirmed. "The school district is trying to coordinate with Metro Transit, but the buses can't get through either. They're setting up temporary shelters at the schools, but parents are panicking. Some are trying to walk through the construction zones, which isn't safe." Dr. Hernandez continued. "The mayor's office called. They're asking if any city employees with emergency management experience can assist with the coordination effort. I know this isn't typically your area, Michael, but you're one of our most reliable problem solvers." Michael's mind was already racing through logistics and solutions, the same systematic thinking that had served him during flood relief operations in Louisiana and infrastructure rebuilds in Afghanistan. "How many children are we talking about?" "Approximately 800 kids across 3 elementary schools," Dr. Hernandez said. "The city's emergency management team is stretched thin, dealing with the water main crisis itself. They need people who can think quickly and organize efficiently." What they didn't know was that Michael had done exactly this before, on a much larger and more dangerous scale. In Kandahar, He'd coordinated the evacuation of a forward operating base when flash floods threatened to overwhelm their position. He'd organized supply chains for villages cut off by destroyed bridges. He'd solved transportation puzzles when lives hung in the balance and failure wasn't an option. But those credentials were buried in personnel files that no one at the hospital had reason to access. To them, he was simply Michael Chen, the maintenance guy who could fix anything and stay calm under pressure. "I'll help," Michael said without hesitation. "What do you need me to do?" Dr. Hernandez looked relieved. "Report to the emergency coordination center they've set up at City Hall. They'll brief you on the specific needs." "And Michael?" "Thank you. I know this is above and beyond your job description." Michael nodded and headed for the exit, his mind already shifting into crisis management mode. He'd need to get to Sophie's school somehow, assess the situation, and figure out how to safely reunite hundreds of children with their families. The water main break had turned a routine Tuesday into an emergency that required immediate action and creative solutions. The scene outside the hospital confirmed the scope of the crisis. Traffic was backed up for blocks in every direction as drivers tried to navigate around the closed streets. Emergency vehicles moved slowly through the gridlock, their sirens creating a constant background of urgency. Michael could see frustrated parents on foot, carrying car seats and pushing strollers as they attempted to reach their children's schools. The walk to City Hall normally took 15 minutes, but today it required careful navigation through crowds of stranded commuters and construction barriers hastily erected around the water main repair site. Michael could see the massive excavation where city crews worked frantically to shut off the main and begin repairs. Water continued to gush from the broken pipe, flooding Hawthorne Boulevard and the surrounding blocks. Inside City Hall, the Emergency Coordination Center buzzed with controlled chaos. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with color-coded pins representing school locations, transportation routes, and emergency personnel. Radio chatter filled the air as coordinators tried to track the movement of people and resources across the affected area. Commander Sarah Walsh, a 20-year veteran of the Portland Police Bureau, briefed Michael quickly on the situation. "We've got parents trying to walk through active construction zones to reach their kids. The water's created sinkholes and unstable ground conditions. We need to establish safe pedestrian routes and coordinate volunteer escorts for families who don't have other options." Michael studied the large map showing the affected area. "What about using the Springwater Corridor trail system? It runs parallel to Hawthorne and connects to the residential neighborhoods where most of the parents live." Commander Walsh looked surprised. "That's actually brilliant. The trail system bypasses all the flood zones. But we'd need guides who know the routes and can handle groups of children safely." "I can organize that," Michael said. "How many volunteers do we have available?" "About 30 so far, mostly off-duty city employees and some parent volunteers who made it through before the road closures." Michael grabbed a marker and began sketching on the map, his military training in logistics and route planning taking over. "We set up 3 staging areas along the trail system. Families check in at the schools, get assigned to groups based on their destination neighborhoods, and volunteer escorts guide them along the safest routes." He continued marking the map, indicating checkpoint locations and alternate paths. "We'll need communication between all the staging areas to track group movements and adjust for any problems. Someone needs to walk the routes first to identify any hazards or obstacles." Commander Walsh studied his impromptu plan. "This could actually work. How long would it take you to set this up?" "Give me 2 hours to scout the routes and position volunteers," Michael said. "But I need to check on my daughter first. She's at Woodstock Elementary." "Understood. Report back here once you've assessed the situation at the school." Michael made his way through the crowded streets toward Woodstock Elementary, observing the growing crisis firsthand. Parents clustered in small groups, sharing information and frustration. Some had been walking for over an hour, carrying sleeping toddlers or pushing elderly relatives in wheelchairs. The community was pulling together, but the lack of organization was creating confusion and potentially dangerous situations. The scene at Woodstock Elementary was both heartening and concerning. Teachers and staff had organized the children into groups in the gymnasium, keeping them occupied with games and activities while they waited for their parents. The children seemed remarkably calm, trusting their teachers to handle the situation. But Michael could see the stress on the adults' faces as they tried to manage hundreds of anxious children while fielding constant phone calls from worried parents. Principal Jennifer Martinez spotted Michael as he entered the building. "Mr. Chen, thank goodness you're here. Sophie's been asking about you. She's helping Mrs. Patterson organize the art supplies for the younger children." Michael found Sophie in the corner of the gymnasium, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a group of kindergartners. She was showing them how to fold paper into simple animals, her voice patient and encouraging as she guided their small fingers through the steps. Mr. Peanuts sat nearby, apparently serving as the demonstration model for paper elephant construction. "Daddy!" Sophie jumped up and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Mrs. Martinez said there's a big water problem and we have to wait here. But I've been helping the little kids so they won't be scared." Michael hugged her tightly, feeling a surge of pride at her natural instinct to help others in a crisis. "You're doing a great job, sweetheart. How would you feel about going on a little adventure with me?" Sophie's eyes brightened. "What kind of adventure?" "I'm going to help families get home safely today. It means we'll be walking instead of taking the bus, and we might not get home until after dinner. Think you're up for it?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Can Mr. Peanuts come too?" "Absolutely. In fact, I think Mr. Peanuts might be very helpful today." Michael found Principal Martinez and explained his role in coordinating the emergency response. "I'm going to be organizing safe walking routes for families. If you're comfortable with it, Sophie can stay with me and help with the younger children during the walks." Principal Martinez looked relieved. "That would be wonderful. She's been amazing with the little ones today. Natural leadership instincts." Michael gathered Sophie's things and they prepared to leave the school together. As they walked toward the exit, he explained what they would be doing and why it was important. Sophie listened with the serious attention she gave to all matters she considered grown-up responsibilities. "So we're going to help families find each other?" she asked. "That's right. Sometimes when big problems happen, people need someone to show them the safe way to go. Like when you helped Mrs. Kim find her cat after the windstorm." Michael smiled. "Exactly like that. Sometimes helping just means knowing the best path and being willing to walk it with someone." They made their way back to City Hall, where Michael spent the next hour refining his plan with Commander Walsh and the other coordinators. The volunteer escorts were briefed on the routes, safety protocols, and communication procedures. Michael divided the affected area into 3 zones, each with its own staging area and designated routes to the residential neighborhoods. Sophie proved surprisingly helpful during the planning process, pointing out playground areas and familiar landmarks that could serve as rest stops for families with young children. Her perspective as someone who actually walked these routes regularly provided insights that the adults had overlooked. "The bridge over Johnson Creek gets really slippery when it's wet," she told Commander Walsh. "And there's a big hole in the fence by the community garden that little kids might fall through." Commander Walsh made notes on these observations. "This is exactly the kind of local knowledge we need. Thank you, Sophie." As the afternoon wore on, the volunteer escorts took their positions along the trail system. Michael and Sophie joined. The team assigned to guide families from Woodstock Elementary to the Selwood neighborhood, a 3-mile route that would normally take an hour, but might take twice that with large groups, including elderly residents and small children. The first group consisted of 12 families, ranging from young parents with babies to grandparents who had been pressed into emergency pickup duty. Michael addressed the group before they began walking, explaining the route and establishing some basic safety guidelines. "We'll be taking the Springwater Corridor Trail to avoid the flooded streets," he explained. "It's a safe route, but we need to stay together as a group. If you have small children, please keep them between the adults. We'll take rest breaks every half-mile or when needed." One of the fathers, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he was more accustomed to boardrooms than hiking trails, spoke up skeptically. "How do we know this trail route is actually safe? Shouldn't we wait for official transportation?" "The city buses can't get through the flood zone," Michael explained patiently. "This route has been scouted and approved by emergency management, but if you prefer to wait at the school, that's your choice." The man looked around at the other families, most of whom were eager to get started. His wife, holding their sleeping toddler, touched his arm gently. "David, let's just go. The girls need to get home." David Carson looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if this route turns out to be more dangerous than waiting, I'm holding someone responsible." Michael had encountered this type of resistance before, usually from people who were accustomed to having control over their situations and felt uncomfortable depending on others. The best approach was to demonstrate competence through action rather than argument. "Understood," Michael said simply. "Let's get started." The group began walking along the trail, Michael leading with Sophie beside him. She had volunteered to help with the youngest children, and soon had 3 toddlers holding hands and singing a walking song she'd learned in preschool. The other children quickly joined in, turning the evacuation into something that felt more like a field trip than an emergency. Michael maintained constant awareness of the group's condition and the environment around them. The trail was in good condition, but he noted several areas where recent rain had created muddy patches that could be slippery for elderly walkers. He adjusted their pace accordingly and pointed out potential hazards before anyone encountered them. About a mile into the walk, they came upon another group that had attempted to take a more direct route through the residential streets. The group was stuck at a flooded intersection, with water too deep to cross safely while carrying children and elderly family members. Their volunteer guide looked frustrated and uncertain. Michael assessed the situation quickly. "We can accommodate your group if you want to backtrack and join our route," he called out. "It's longer but completely dry." The stranded guide, a young woman wearing a City Parks Department jacket, looked relieved. "That would be amazing. We've been stuck here for 20 minutes trying to figure out an alternative." Within a few minutes, Michael's group had grown from 12 families to 18, including several elderly residents who were struggling with the longer-than-expected walk. He reorganized the group, pairing stronger walkers with those who needed assistance, and established a slower pace that everyone could maintain comfortably. David Carson, who had been watching Michael's crisis management with growing interest, approached him during a rest break. "You seem to know what you're doing. Is this part of your regular job?" Michael was helping an elderly woman adjust her walking shoes and didn't look up. "I work maintenance at Providence Medical Center, but I've done some volunteer emergency response work." "What kind of emergency response?" Sophie, who was sharing her water bottle with a thirsty kindergartner, answered before Michael could. "Daddy used to be in the army. He helped people when bad things happened." David's eyebrows raised. "Army, what did you do?" Michael finally looked up from the elderly woman's shoes. "Engineering Corps. Infrastructure and logistics mainly." The simple answer didn't capture the full scope of Michael's experience, but it was accurate enough. What it didn't mention was the Bronze Star for his coordination of relief efforts after the Kandahar flood, or the Commendation for establishing supply lines to isolated villages in Afghanistan's mountain regions. Awards that were packed away in a box under his bed, along with other reminders of a life that seemed increasingly distant from his current reality. "Well, whatever your background," David said, "you're doing an excellent job today. I owe you an apology for questioning your competence earlier." Michael nodded acknowledgement but didn't dwell on the praise. There were still 2 miles to walk, and 18 families depending on him to get them home safely. Personal recognition was less important than successful mission completion, a principle that had guided him through 8 years of military service and now shaped his approach to civilian crisis management. The group resumed walking, now moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who trusted their guide and understood their shared goal. Children who had started the walk as strangers were now playing games together, and adults were sharing stories and contact information. The crisis that had begun with frustration and fear was fostering community connections that might not have developed otherwise. As they approached the final mile of the route, Michael's radio crackled with updates from the other escort groups. 2 groups had successfully completed their routes without incident. A third group had encountered a fallen tree blocking their path, but had cleared it with help from volunteers. The emergency transportation plan was working, getting families safely home, despite the infrastructure crisis. Michael felt the familiar satisfaction of a well-executed mission, the same feeling he'd experienced after successfully completing supply runs in hostile territory or coordinating medical evacuations under difficult conditions. The skills were transferable, even if the stakes were different. Helping people get home safely was still helping people get home safely, whether the obstacles were enemy fire or broken water mains. The final stretch of trail led them into the heart of the Selwood neighborhood, where family members were waiting anxiously for their loved ones' arrival. Reunions played out along the tree-lined streets as children ran to grandparents and spouses embraced after hours of worry. Michael watched these moments with quiet satisfaction, knowing that his planning and leadership had made them possible. David Carson approached him one final time as the group dispersed. "I want to give you my business card," he said, pulling out his wallet. "I'm the regional manager for Cascade Construction. We're always looking for people with real leadership experience and problem-solving abilities." Michael accepted the card politely. "Thank you. I appreciate the offer." "I'm serious about this," David continued. "What you did today, organizing this evacuation and managing all these different personalities and needs, that's executive-level crisis management. You could be making 3 times what you're making now." Sophie tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Daddy, can we go home now? Mr. Peanuts is tired from all the walking." Michael looked down at his daughter, then back at David. "Thank you for the opportunity, but I'm happy with my current position. It gives me the flexibility to be there for Sophie when she needs me." David looked puzzled, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would choose family time over career advancement. "Well, keep the card anyway, in case you change your mind." As they walked the final blocks to their apartment building, Sophie chatted about the day's adventure and all the new friends she'd made during the walk. Michael listened with half his attention while the other half processed the day's events. He'd used skills that had been dormant for years, had proven to himself that those abilities were still sharp and accessible when needed. But more importantly, he'd been able to help his community during a crisis while keeping Sophie safe and included in the process. She'd seen him in a leadership role, had contributed meaningfully to the effort, and had learned something about how ordinary people could make a difference when circumstances demanded it. The lights in their small apartment had never looked more welcoming. Michael helped Sophie get cleaned up from their long walk while she continued to replay the day's events. As they prepared a simple dinner together, she asked the question that had been building all afternoon. "Daddy, why didn't you tell people you were a real soldier?" David seemed really surprised when I mentioned it. To show, Michael considered his answer carefully. "Sometimes it's better to let people see what you can do now, rather than telling them what you used to do. Actions matter more than titles." Sophie nodded thoughtfully, like how Mrs. Patterson doesn't tell everyone she used to be a professional dancer, but you can tell because of how she moves when she teaches us. Exactly like that. The important thing isn't what job someone used to have. It's how they treat people, and whether they help when help is needed. As they ate dinner, Michael reflected on the unexpected turn his day had taken. What had started as routine maintenance work had become an opportunity to serve his community in a way that felt meaningful and familiar. He'd been reminded that leadership skills, once developed, didn't disappear just because the uniform came off. But he'd also been reminded of the choice he'd made when Sophie was born, the decision to prioritize being her father over pursuing career advancement. David Carson's job offer represented opportunities that Michael had deliberately walked away from, chances for recognition and financial success that would require sacrifices he wasn't willing to make. The day had shown him that he could still rise to meet emergencies when they arose, could still organize and lead and solve complex problems under pressure. But it had also confirmed that his current life, modest as it might appear to outside observers, was built around values that mattered more to him than professional achievement. As Sophie drifted off to sleep that night, Mr. Peanuts tucked securely under her arm, she murmured sleepily, "I'm proud of you, Daddy. You helped all those families get home safe." Michael kissed her forehead gently. "We helped them, sweetheart. We did it together." But what Michael didn't know, as he settled into his own bed that night, was that the day's events had been witnessed by someone whose life would be forever changed by what she'd observed. Someone who would spend the next several hours unable to stop thinking about the man who'd carried a sleeping child through the night and then organized an emergency evacuation with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to much larger responsibilities. The crisis had passed, but its consequences were just beginning. Victoria Lawson sat in her corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, staring out at the Portland skyline as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern mountains. She hadn't slept. The image of the man carrying his daughter through the flooded streets kept replaying in her mind, along with something else she'd witnessed that had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Her assistant, Marcus Williams, knocked softly on the glass door before entering with a steaming cup of coffee and a worried expression. "You've been here all night again, haven't you?" Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully. "I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday, about what I saw during the water main crisis." Marcus settled into the chair across from her desk. He'd worked for Victoria for 7 years, long enough to recognize when something had genuinely unsettled his usually unflappable boss. "Want to talk about it?" Victoria pulled up the local news coverage on her tablet, scrolling through articles about the emergency response. "Look at this headline. Community heroes emerge during transportation crisis." Oh, but they're focusing on the wrong story. The articles praised city officials and emergency management coordinators, with brief mentions of volunteer escorts who had helped families navigate around the flood zones. There were quotes from grateful parents and statistics about successful evacuations, but nothing that captured what Victoria had actually witnessed. "I saw something yesterday that I can't get out of my head," Victoria began, setting down her coffee. "After the board meeting, when we were driving back through the affected area, I noticed this man walking along Hawthorne Boulevard. He was carrying a sleeping child on his back, just the two of them moving through all that chaos." Marcus nodded, encouraging her to continue. "At first, I thought it was just another stranded parent trying to get home. But there was something different about the way he moved, the way he assessed his surroundings. So I asked James to follow at a distance, just out of curiosity." Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city where thousands of people were beginning their morning commutes. "We watched him for over an hour, Marcus. This man didn't just walk home. He stopped at 3 different emergency staging areas, talked to coordinators, organized groups of families, and led them through routes that avoided all the dangerous areas." "Sounds like a good Samaritan," Marcus said. "No, it was more than that. I've been in enough crisis management meetings to recognize real leadership when I see it. This wasn't someone volunteering to help. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing, who had training and experience that went far beyond good intentions." Victoria returned to her desk and pulled up the employee database for Providence Medical Center, where she'd seen the man's name tag during one of her brief glimpses. "I did some research last night. His name is Michael Chen. He works maintenance at the hospital. Single father, lives in a studio apartment in southeast Portland." "You looked up a random maintenance worker?" Marcus seemed surprised by the extent of Victoria's investigation. That's just it, Marcus. There was nothing random about what I observed. The way he organized those families, the route planning, the crisis management skills, it reminded me of something I'd seen before. Victoria's expression grew distant as she remembered her father, Colonel James Lawson, who had served 3 tours in Iraq before retiring to work in corporate security. She'd grown up around military personnel, had learned to recognize the particular combination of calm competence and situational awareness that came from real combat experience. I think Michael Chen has a military background that he's not advertising, Victoria said. And I want to know why someone with that level of capability is working maintenance at a hospital and living in poverty with his daughter. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Victoria, you can't just investigate employees from other companies because you're curious about their personal histories. There are privacy laws, not to mention ethical considerations. Victoria held up her hand. I'm not planning to violate anyone's privacy, but I am planning to make a phone call. She reached for her desk phone and dialed the main number for Providence Medical Center. After being transferred twice, she was connected with Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the emergency coordinator who had worked with Michael during the crisis. Dr. Hernandez, this is Victoria Lawson from Meridian Industries. I wanted to commend your hospital's response during yesterday's emergency, particularly the work of one of your maintenance staff members, Michael Chen. Dr. Hernandez sounded pleased, but surprised. Michael was extraordinary yesterday. He volunteered to help coordinate the evacuation efforts, even though it was completely outside his job description. We're lucky to have him on our team. Has he done emergency coordination work for the hospital before? Not officially, but Michael has a reputation for staying calm under pressure and finding creative solutions to complex problems. Yesterday was the first time I'd seen him take a leadership role in a crisis, but he seemed completely comfortable with the responsibility. Victoria thanked Dr. Hernandez and ended the call, then sat back in her chair, processing what she'd learned. Marcus waited patiently for her to explain her next move. I want to meet with him, Victoria finally said. Not as a CEO investigating an employee, but as someone who recognizes talent that's being wasted. What exactly are you thinking? Victoria turned back to the window, her mind already formulating a plan. Meridian Industries has been looking for someone to head our new Community Infrastructure Resilience program, someone who understands both technical systems and crisis management, who can work with local government and coordinate emergency responses. Marcus raised his eyebrows. You want to offer a maintenance worker an executive position based on watching him walk through a flood zone? I want to offer a clearly qualified leader, an opportunity that matches his actual capabilities, Victoria corrected. The question is whether he'll be interested. That afternoon, Victoria did something she hadn't done in years. She left her office in the middle of the workday and drove herself to Providence Medical Center, parking in the visitor lot, rather than having James drop her off at the main entrance. She felt oddly nervous as she made her way through the hospital corridors, asking directions to the maintenance department. She found Michael in the basement mechanical room, replacing filters in one of the massive air handling units that kept the hospital's air circulation system running. He was completely absorbed in his work, testing each connection methodically and making notes on a clipboard. Victoria watched for several minutes before announcing her presence, struck by the same attention to detail and systematic approach she'd observed during the evacuation. Mr. Chen. Michael looked up, surprised to see a woman in an expensive business suit standing in the doorway of the mechanical room. Can I help you? If you're looking for someone, the main information desk is on the first floor. Actually, I was looking for you specifically. My name is Victoria Lawson. I'm the CEO of Meridian Industries. Michael set down his tools and wiped his hands on a shop rag, clearly puzzled by this unexpected visit. Is there something I can do for you, Ms. Lawson? Victoria stepped further into the room, noting the organized tool arrangements and the detailed maintenance logs that covered one wall. Everything about Michael's workspace spoke to professional competence and systematic thinking. I was in the area during yesterday's emergency, and I witnessed some of your coordination work with the evacuation efforts. I was impressed by what I saw. Michael's expression became guarded. I just helped out where I could. It wasn't anything special. I disagree. What I observed was sophisticated crisis management and logistics coordination. Those aren't skills that most people develop through maintenance work. A long silence stretched between them as Michael seemed to be weighing how much to reveal. Victoria could see the internal calculation happening behind his eyes, the same careful assessment she'd noticed during the emergency. I had some training in the army, Michael finally said. Engineering Corps. But that was a long time ago. How long ago? And I've been out for 4 years. Since my daughter was born. Victoria nodded, sensing that there was much more to the story, but recognizing that Michael wasn't ready to share details with a stranger. What did you do in the engineering corps? Michael returned to his work on the air handler, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Infrastructure support mainly, keeping systems running in challenging environments. The modest description didn't match what Victoria had observed, but she decided not to push for more information. Instead, she changed her approach. Mr. Chen, I'd like to make you an offer. Meridian Industries is launching a new community resilience program focused on improving infrastructure coordination and emergency response capabilities. We need someone to lead that initiative, someone who understands both technical systems and crisis management. Michael stopped working and looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived. You're offering me a job based on one afternoon of volunteer work? I'm offering you a position based on demonstrated leadership capabilities and relevant experience. The volunteer work just happened to be how I became aware of your qualifications. Michael set down his tools completely and leaned against the workbench. Ms. Lawson, I appreciate the offer, but I'm happy with my current position. It provides stability for my family and allows me to maintain the work-life balance that's important to me. Victoria had expected this response. Would you be willing to at least hear the details of what the position would involve? No commitment, just a conversation about the opportunity. Michael considered this for a moment. I suppose that couldn't hurt. When did you have in mind? Tomorrow evening? I could come by your apartment, meet your daughter, make this less formal than an office meeting. The suggestion surprised Michael. Corporate executives didn't typically make house calls to interview potential employees. You want to come to my apartment? See if you're comfortable with that. I think it's important to understand someone's complete situation before discussing major career changes. Michael gave her his address and they agreed on a time. As Victoria prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway of the mechanical room. Can I ask you something, Mr. Chen? Yesterday, when you were organizing those evacuation routes, you seemed completely comfortable with command responsibility. That's not something most people can do effectively, even with training. Where did that confidence come from? Michael was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been during the rest of their conversation. When people are depending on you to get them home safely, you find whatever capabilities you need to find. The alternative isn't acceptable. Victoria nodded, understanding more than Michael probably realized. Her father had said something similar once when she'd asked him about his military service. Some responsibilities were too important for self-doubt or hesitation. The next evening, Victoria found herself climbing the narrow stairs to Michael and Sophie's apartment, carrying a folder containing job descriptions and program details she'd spent most of the day refining. She felt more nervous than she had before major board presentations, though she couldn't entirely explain why this conversation mattered so much to her. Michael answered the door wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, looking more relaxed than he had in the hospital's basement. Behind him, a small girl with dark hair and bright eyes peered curiously at the visitor. Ms. Lawson, this is my daughter Sophie. Sophie, this is the lady I told you about who wanted to talk about work stuff. Sophie stepped forward with the solemn politeness of a child who had been coached on meeting important adults. Nice to meet you, Ms. Lawson. Daddy said you saw us helping people yesterday. Victoria knelt down to Sophie's eye level. I did see you helping. You were very brave, walking all that way and taking care of the younger children. Sophie beamed at the praise. Daddy says helping people is the most important job anyone can have. Victoria glanced up at Michael, who was watching the interaction with quiet pride. Your father is absolutely right about that. The apartment was small but immaculately organized, with children's artwork covering one wall and a small dining table that served multiple purposes. Victoria noticed a violin case in the corner and several engineering textbooks on a shelf beside children's picture books. Michael offered her coffee, and they settled at the dining table while Sophie worked on homework nearby, occasionally contributing to the conversation with observations about school or questions about Victoria's work. Tell me about the Community Resilience Program, Michael said once they were seated. Victoria opened her folder and began explaining the initiative. Meridian Industries has been awarded a contract to develop improved emergency response protocols for the Portland metropolitan area. The position would involve working with city government, coordinating with emergency services, and developing training programs for community leaders. Michael listened carefully as she outlined the responsibilities and requirements. The position would pay significantly more than his hospital job and include benefits that would provide much better security for Sophie's future. But Victoria could see the reservations in his expression. It sounds like meaningful work, Michael said diplomatically. But I'm concerned about the time commitment. Sophie needs consistency in her life, and she's had enough disruption already. Victoria had researched enough of Michael's background to understand the reference to disruption. Public records showed that his wife had died 3 years ago, and that the family had faced financial difficulties around the same time. The position would involve some travel for training and conferences, but most of the work would be local. And Meridian offers comprehensive family support benefits, including emergency childcare and flexible scheduling. Sophie looked up from her homework. Would Daddy have to wear a suit to work? Victoria smiled. Not necessarily. The work involves spending time in the field, visiting infrastructure sites and emergency shelters. Practical clothing would often be more appropriate. That's good, Sophie said seriously. Daddy doesn't like fancy clothes. He says they make it harder to fix things. Michael looked embarrassed by his daughter's commentary, but Victoria found it charming. She was beginning to understand that Sophie's observations provided insight into Michael's character and priorities. Can I ask you something personal, Mr. Chen? Victoria said. What made you leave the military? Michael was quiet for a moment, glancing at Sophie, who had returned to her homework but was clearly listening to the adult conversation. When Sophie was born, I realized that my first responsibility was to be her father. Military service involves sacrifices that I wasn't willing to make anymore. But you clearly maintained your skills and training. Yesterday's emergency response wasn't something you could have improvised without significant experience. Michael met her eyes directly. Some experiences stay with you whether you want them to or not. The skills can be useful in civilian situations, but they come with costs that not everyone understands. Victoria sensed deeper layers to this statement, but didn't push for details. Instead, she changed direction. What if the position could be structured to accommodate your priorities as a father? What if we could create a role that used your capabilities while supporting your family responsibilities? Michael leaned back in his chair, considering this. What would that look like practically? Victoria had been hoping he would ask this question. Flexible scheduling that works around Sophie's school hours. A home office option for administrative work. Family health insurance that includes comprehensive coverage for both of you. And a salary that would allow you to provide Sophie with opportunities that aren't possible on a maintenance worker's income. Sophie looked up again. Would I still go to the same school? And if you wanted to, Victoria assured her, Though you might also have the option to attend other schools if you were interested. Michael was clearly wrestling with the decision. Victoria could see the appeal of the opportunity competing with his natural caution about major changes. "I need to think about this," Michael said finally. "It's not just my decision to make." Victoria nodded and gathered her materials. "Of course, take whatever time you need. But can I ask what would help you make the decision?" Michael looked at Sophie, who was now pretending to focus on her homework while obviously listening to every word. "I'd need to be convinced that the work would actually make a difference in people's lives. And I'd need to know that Sophie would be better off, not just financially, but in all the ways that matter." Victoria stood to leave but paused at the door. "Mr. Chen, can I tell you why I'm really here?" Michael nodded. "Yesterday I watched you carry your sleeping daughter through a crisis zone and then immediately turn around to help dozens of other families get home safely. You didn't do it for recognition or reward. You did it because it needed to be done, and you had the ability to do it." Victoria's voice grew more passionate as she continued. "I've spent 15 years in corporate leadership, and I've learned that the most important quality in any executive isn't intelligence or ambition. It's the willingness to take responsibility for other people's welfare, even when it's difficult or inconvenient." Michael listened without interrupting. "You've already proven that you have that quality. The question is whether you're willing to use it on a larger scale, with better resources and greater impact." As Victoria walked back to her car, she reflected on the conversation and what she'd learned about Michael Chen. He was clearly more than qualified for the position she was offering. But his reservations weren't about capability or confidence. They were about ensuring that any decision he made would serve Sophie's best interests. Victoria found this prioritization refreshing after years of dealing with executives who measured success primarily in terms of personal advancement. Michael's approach to decision-making was fundamentally different, grounded in responsibility to others rather than ambition for himself. The question now was whether she could structure an opportunity that would appeal to someone whose primary motivation was being a good father rather than achieving professional recognition. Victoria had never encountered this particular challenge in recruiting, but she was determined to find a solution. Back in the apartment, Michael helped Sophie finish her homework while processing the conversation he'd just had. The job offer represented opportunities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine, chances to use his training and experience in ways that could benefit entire communities. But it also represented risks that affected more than just himself. Sophie had already experienced enough instability in her young life. Any decision Michael made had to be evaluated through the lens of what would be best for her, not just what might be professionally satisfying for him. As he tucked Sophie into bed that night, she asked the question he'd been expecting. "Are you going to take the new job, Daddy?" Michael sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. What do you think I should do?" Sophie considered this seriously. The lady seemed nice, and she said you could help more people if you took the job. "That's true. But it would also mean changes for both of us." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Would we still be together?" "Always," Michael assured her. "No matter what job I have or where we live, we'll always be together." "Then I think you should help more people," Sophie said, with the simple clarity that children brought to complex problems. "You're really good at helping people." As Michael turned off the lights and prepared for bed himself, he realized that Sophie had identified the core issue more clearly than any of the adults involved. The question wasn't whether he was qualified for Victoria's offer or whether it would provide better financial security. The question was whether he could do more good for more people in a new role than he was doing in his current position. The answer to that question would determine not just his professional future, but the kind of example he set for his daughter about using whatever capabilities you had been given to serve something larger than yourself. It was a decision that would require him to balance personal security against the possibility of making a meaningful difference in other people's lives. The choice would shape both their futures in ways that neither of them could fully predict. 3 days after Victoria's visit, Michael was still wrestling with her offer when the call came that would change everything. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night, and Sophie had been asleep for over an hour when his phone rang with the distinctive tone he'd assigned to emergency contacts. Janet's voice was tight with stress when he answered. "Michael, I'm sorry to call so late, but we have a situation at the hospital. The main electrical transformer failed during the storm, and we're running on backup power. The problem is, the backup system is showing stress fractures we didn't know existed." Michael sat up in bed, instantly alert. "How long do we have on the current backup?" "Maybe 6 hours, possibly less. The city's electrical crews can't get here until morning because of the storm damage throughout the metro area. We've got 43 patients in intensive care, including 12 on life support systems that can't be moved." Michael was already reaching for his clothes. "What about the portable generators?" "We have them, but they're not integrated with the hospital's main systems. Someone would need to manually configure the connections and monitor the power distribution to keep the critical systems running." Michael understood immediately. The portable generators could provide power, but without proper integration, they could also create dangerous electrical surges that might damage sensitive medical equipment or, worse, harm patients. The job required someone who understood both electrical systems and emergency protocols under extreme pressure. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Michael said. "Michael, I have to tell you, this isn't a normal maintenance situation. If something goes wrong, if we lose power to those life support systems..." Janet's voice trailed off. "I understand the stakes," Michael replied quietly. "Have you contacted Dr. Hernandez?" "She's coordinating with the medical staff to prioritize which systems are absolutely critical. But Michael, the technical decisions about power distribution, those have to be made by someone who understands the infrastructure." After ending the call, Michael stood in the dark apartment, listening to the wind and rain battering the windows. Sophie was safe here, asleep in her bed, but 43 critically ill patients were depending on systems that might fail within hours. The choice was clear, but the logistics were complicated. He called his neighbor Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had become something of a grandmother figure to Sophie. Despite the late hour, she answered immediately and agreed to come stay with Sophie without asking for details. Michael left a note explaining that he had to handle an emergency at work and would be back as soon as possible. The drive to Providence Medical Center through the storm-damaged streets took longer than usual. Traffic lights were out in several intersections. Trees blocked portions of major roads, and emergency vehicles moved constantly through the area, responding to storm-related crises. Michael navigated carefully, his mind already working through the technical challenges he would face once he arrived. The hospital's main lobby was dimly lit by emergency lighting when Michael arrived. Staff moved with the controlled urgency of people managing a crisis that could escalate rapidly. Dr. Hernandez met him at the main desk, her usual composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "The situation is worse than Janet initially described," she said without preamble. "We've identified structural damage to the main electrical panel that's affecting our ability to maintain stable power distribution. The backup generators are keeping critical systems running, but we're seeing voltage fluctuations that could damage equipment or endanger patients." Michael followed her to the electrical utility room in the basement, where 3 portable generators hummed loudly in the narrow space. Thick power cables snaked across the floor, connecting to hastily assembled distribution panels that would normally handle much lower power loads. Janet was there with 2 other maintenance workers, all of them looking overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. "We've got power to the ICU and the emergency department," Janet explained, "but the distribution is unstable. We're afraid to add more systems to the network because we don't know how much load these connections can handle." Michael surveyed the setup, noting immediately several potential points of failure. The portable generators were designed for temporary power, not for the sustained, precise electrical requirements of hospital equipment. The connections were functional, but not optimized for the sensitive electronics that kept patients alive. "Show me the electrical schematics for the building," Michael said. Janet looked puzzled. "I don't think we have detailed schematics." The building's electrical system was installed in phases over 30 years. Michael had encountered this problem before in field hospitals and temporary medical facilities where precise electrical documentation didn't exist. "Then we'll have to map the systems manually while we work." For the next hour, Michael systematically traced electrical connections throughout the basement and ground floor, creating a hand-drawn schematic that showed how power flowed to different areas of the hospital. His military training in infrastructure assessment proved invaluable as he identified the critical pathways and potential vulnerabilities in the improvised power grid. Dr. Hernandez accompanied him on several of these surveys, asking questions that revealed her growing recognition of Michael's expertise. "How do you know which circuits are safe to load and which ones might fail?" she asked as they examined connections in the intensive care unit. "Experience with field installations," Michael replied, testing a connection with a voltage meter. When you're setting up medical facilities in areas without reliable infrastructure, you learn to assess electrical systems quickly and accurately. "What kind of field installations?" Michael continued his measurements without looking up. "Military hospitals, refugee camps, disaster relief operations, places where people's lives depend on keeping the power on with whatever equipment is available." Dr. Hernandez studied his methodical approach with growing interest. This wasn't the work of someone who had learned electrical maintenance through civilian training. This was the systematic problem-solving of someone who had managed life-and-death infrastructure challenges under extreme conditions. By 3 a.m., Michael had successfully reconfigured the power distribution to provide stable electricity to all critical systems. But the real test came when Dr. Hernandez received word that an ambulance was en route with multiple trauma patients from a car accident. The emergency department would need to activate additional equipment that would strain the improvised electrical system beyond its tested capacity. "Can the current setup handle the additional load?" Dr. Hernandez asked. Michael studied his hand-drawn schematics and the power consumption data he'd been tracking. "Probably, but there's no margin for error. If we have any equipment failures or sudden power demands, we could lose everything." "What would you recommend?" Michael was quiet for a moment, calculating risks and alternatives. "I can reconfigure the system to handle the additional load, but it will require shutting down power to non-critical areas of the hospital for about 15 minutes while I make the changes." Dr. Hernandez looked concerned. "What if something goes wrong during those 15 minutes? Then we'll be in the same situation we're in now, except with a more robust electrical system that can handle emergencies like incoming trauma patients." The decision ultimately fell to Dr. Hernandez as the senior medical officer on duty. She looked around at the improvised electrical setup, then at Michael, who was waiting calmly for her choice. "Do it," she said. Michael spent the next few minutes briefing the medical staff on what to expect during the power transition. He coordinated with the ICU nurses to ensure that all life support equipment had adequate battery backup, and he verified that emergency lighting systems were functioning properly throughout the hospital. At 3:27 a.m., Michael began the reconfiguration process. Working alone in the basement utility room, he systematically disconnected and reconnected power cables according to the plan he'd developed. The hospital fell into partial darkness as non-critical systems shut down, leaving only emergency lighting and battery-powered equipment running. For 12 minutes, 43 patients in intensive care depended entirely on battery backup systems, while Michael rewired the electrical distribution network in near-complete darkness. His hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed similar operations under enemy fire, when any mistake could cost lives and there was no opportunity for second chances. When the new electrical configuration came online, it did so smoothly and powerfully. Lights returned throughout the hospital, medical equipment resumed normal operation, and the power distribution system showed stable voltage levels across all connected systems. Dr. Hernandez found Michael in the utility room, making final adjustments to the generator connections. "The trauma patients are being treated successfully," she reported. "All electrical systems are functioning normally. How did you know the reconfiguration would work?" Michael wiped sweat from his forehead with a shop rag. "I didn't know for certain, but I understood the risks of not making the changes versus the risks of making them. Sometimes you have to choose the option that gives you the best chance of success, even if it involves temporary vulnerability." That sounds like military doctrine. Michael met her eyes directly for the first time since the crisis began. It is military doctrine, risk assessment and mitigation under pressure. The principles apply whether you're managing field operations or hospital electrical systems. Dr. Hernandez leaned against the doorframe. "Michael, what you did tonight, the systematic problem-solving, the crisis management, the willingness to take responsibility for life and death decisions, that's not maintenance work. That's engineering leadership at the highest level." Michael continued adjusting the generator settings. "Right now, it's whatever it needs to be to keep those patients alive." The rest of the night passed without incident. The improvised electrical system that Michael had designed held steady through several more equipment activations and power demands. By morning, city electrical crews had arrived to begin repairing the main transformer, but Michael's emergency configuration had successfully maintained critical hospital operations through the crisis. As the sun rose over Portland, Michael found himself in Dr. Hernandez's office, drinking coffee and completing the incident report that would document the night's events. Janet had gone home to get some sleep, and the regular day shift was taking over normal hospital operations. "I need to ask you something," Dr. Hernandez said. "The electrical work you did last night, the risk assessment, the systematic problem-solving under extreme pressure, where did you learn those skills?" Michael set down his coffee cup. "United States Army Corps of Engineers. 8 years, mostly overseas deployments maintaining critical infrastructure in combat zones." Dr. Hernandez nodded as if confirming something she had suspected. "Why didn't you ever mention your military background? Those qualifications would have been relevant to several situations we've faced here." "Because I'm not that person anymore," Michael said quietly. "I left the military to be Sophie's father. The skills are useful when emergencies arise, but they're not who I am now. But they're clearly still part of who you are. What you did last night saved lives, Michael. 43 patients went home to their families because you were willing to take responsibility for keeping their life support systems running." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing the events of the night and their implications. "It needed to be done, and I had the ability to do it. The choice was obvious." Dr. Hernandez studied him with the expression of someone seeing clearly for the first time. "There's something else I need to tell you. Yesterday, I received a call from Victoria Lawson at Meridian Industries. She was asking about your work during the water main emergency." Michael looked up, surprised. "She seemed very interested in your emergency management capabilities. She mentioned that Meridian is developing some kind of community infrastructure program. She offered me a position leading that program." Dr. Hernandez smiled. "After what I witnessed last night, I think you should seriously consider her offer. What you did here demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership that could make a real difference on a larger scale." Michael finished his coffee and prepared to leave. "I appreciate your confidence, Dr. Hernandez. But any decision I make has to be based on what's best for Sophie, not just what might be professionally satisfying. Have you considered that what's best for Sophie might include having a father who uses his full capabilities to serve his community? Children learn as much from what we do as from what we tell them." "Please, As Michael walked home through the morning streets, he reflected on Dr. Hernandez's words and the events of the night. For 8 hours, he had operated at the level of expertise and responsibility that he'd known in the military, making decisions that affected dozens of lives and solving problems that required both technical knowledge and leadership judgment. The work had felt familiar and meaningful in ways that routine maintenance never did. But it had also reminded him of the weight of responsibility that came with those capabilities, the stress of making decisions where failure meant people died. When he arrived home, Sophie was awake and eating breakfast with Mrs. Chen, who reported that she had slept through the night without any problems. Sophie hugged Michael enthusiastically and began chattering about her plans for the day, apparently unaware that her father had spent the night saving lives at the hospital. Mrs. Chen gathered her things and prepared to leave. "And, emergency at work?" she asked quietly. "Power problems at the hospital. Some very sick patients needed their equipment to keep working." Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly. "You look tired but satisfied. Important work, I think." And after Mrs. Chen left, Michael sat at the small dining table with Sophie, listening to her describe the dream she'd had about flying elephants while his mind continued processing the night's events. The contrast between his daughter's innocent concerns and the life-and-death decisions he'd been making just hours earlier was stark, but not uncomfortable. Both were part of who he was, different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to taking care of people who depended on him. Sophie finished her breakfast and began gathering her things for a day at her friend Emma's house, a play date that had been planned for weeks. As Michael helped her pack her overnight bag, she asked the question that had become routine whenever he worked unusual hours. "Was it a big emergency, Daddy?" "They're pretty big, but everything worked out okay." Sophie nodded seriously. "Because you're good at fixing things that are broken." Michael smiled. "I suppose I am." As he walked Sophie to Emma's house, Michael realized that the night's events had clarified something important about Victoria's job offer. The question wasn't whether he was qualified for the position or whether it would provide better financial security. The question was whether he could do more good for more people in a role that fully utilized his capabilities. The answer had become obvious. Michael Chen was ready to stop hiding from who he really was. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that Portland rarely offered in early spring. Michael stood outside the glass entrance of Meridian Industries, holding Sophie's hand as they both stared up at the 42-story tower that gleamed in the morning sunlight. His acceptance of Victoria's offer had surprised everyone, including himself, but the hospital emergency had crystallized something he'd been avoiding for too long. "It's really tall," Sophie observed, craning her neck to see the top floors. "Do you think they have good elevators?" Michael smiled. "I guess we'll find out together." 6 months had passed since that stormy night at Providence Medical Center, and the transformation in both their lives had been remarkable. Victoria had restructured the community resilience position to accommodate Michael's priorities as a single father, creating a role that allowed him to work primarily from a field office near Sophie's school, while maintaining the flexibility to be present for her activities and needs. The elevator ride to the 38th floor gave Michael time to reflect on how much had changed. His first day at Meridian had been overwhelming, stepping into a corporate environment that felt foreign after years of maintenance work and military service. But Victoria had been patient, introducing him gradually to the company culture while allowing him to focus on the technical aspects of infrastructure development that matched his expertise. The Community Resilience Program had grown beyond either of their initial expectations. Michael's military background and crisis management experience had proven invaluable in developing emergency response protocols that actually worked in real-world situations. His ability to assess infrastructure vulnerabilities and coordinate multi-agency responses had earned respect from city officials. emergency service leaders, and community organizations throughout the metropolitan area. Victoria's assistant, Marcus, greeted them in the lobby of the executive floor. "Good morning, Michael. And you must be Sophie. Your father talks about you constantly in meetings." Sophie giggled and looked up at Michael. "Do you really talk about me at work?" "Only when it's relevant to important business decisions," Michael replied with mock seriousness. They were escorted to the conference room, where Victoria was waiting with several other executives and community leaders. Today marked the official launch of the Regional Emergency Preparedness Initiative, a comprehensive program that Michael had spent months developing with input from emergency services, local government and community organizations throughout Portland. Victoria stood to greet them, and Michael was struck again by how much their professional relationship had evolved. What had begun as a corporate recruitment effort had developed into a genuine partnership based on shared values and complementary skills. Victoria's business acumen and political connections, combined with Michael's technical expertise and community credibility, had created something neither could have achieved alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria addressed the room, "I'd like you to meet the architect of our emergency preparedness program, Michael Chen, and his daughter Sophie, who has been an unofficial consultant on making our initiatives family-friendly." Sophie beamed at being recognized as a consultant, while Michael felt the familiar mix of pride and humility that came with public recognition. The program they were launching represented months of work, but more importantly, it represented a new approach to emergency management that prioritized community resilience over bureaucratic efficiency. The presentation that followed showcased the comprehensive network of emergency response capabilities that Michael had helped develop. Training programs for community leaders, improved communication systems between agencies, infrastructure vulnerability assessments, and rapid response protocols that could be activated during crises like the water main break that had brought them together. Dr. Patricia Hernandez was among the community representatives present, and she spoke about the hospital's participation in the program. "Michael's work has helped us develop backup systems and emergency protocols that go far beyond what we thought possible. His ability to see connections between different infrastructure systems has made our entire medical campus more resilient." Commander Sarah Walsh from the Portland Police Bureau added her endorsement. "The coordination frameworks that Michael developed have already improved our response times and resource allocation during emergencies. We're seeing measurable improvements in community safety." As the formal presentations concluded, Michael found himself in conversation with several city officials who wanted to discuss expanding the program to other metropolitan areas. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most to him was the knowledge that the work was actually making a difference in people's lives. Sophie had spent the meeting quietly drawing pictures of buildings and emergency vehicles in a notebook that Victoria had provided. When the adults finished their discussions, she approached the conference table and showed her artwork to the assembled group. "This is Daddy's new job," she explained, pointing to a drawing that showed stick figures helping other stick figures during what appeared to be a flood. "He helps people when bad things happen, but now he has better tools and more friends to help him." Victoria studied the drawing with genuine interest. "That's exactly right, Sophie. Your father has always helped people, but now he can help more people more effectively." As the meeting dispersed, Victoria asked Michael to stay behind for a private conversation. Sophie settled into a chair by the window, continuing her artwork while the adults talked. "I wanted you to know," Victoria began, "that the board approved expansion funding for the program. We'll be able to hire additional staff and extend our services to 3 more counties." Michael nodded, pleased but not surprised. The program's success had been evident from its early implementation, with measurable improvements in emergency response times and community preparedness. "There's something else," Victoria continued. The State Emergency Management Agency has asked if you'd be willing to serve as a consultant on statewide infrastructure resilience. It would involve some travel, but nothing that would interfere with your responsibilities to Sophie. Michael considered this opportunity. Expanding his work to the state level would allow him to address infrastructure vulnerabilities on a much larger scale, potentially preventing the kinds of disasters that had tested communities throughout Oregon. What would that look like practically? Monthly meetings in Salem, occasional site visits to assess critical infrastructure, and input on policy development. The work would complement what you're already doing here, just with broader impact. Michael looked over at Sophie, who was now drawing what appeared to be helicopters rescuing people from rooftops. Her acceptance of his career change had been complete and enthusiastic, but he remained committed to ensuring that professional opportunities never came at the expense of his availability as her father. I'd be interested as long as the scheduling remains flexible around Sophie's needs. Victoria smiled. I wouldn't expect anything else from you. Family first, always. As they prepared to leave the office, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The transformation from maintenance worker to community resilience director had been dramatic, but it felt like a natural evolution rather than a sudden change. The skills and values that had guided him through military service and single parenthood were the same ones that shaped his approach to emergency management and community leadership. Sophie gathered her drawings and tucked them carefully into her backpack alongside Mr. Peanuts, who continued to accompany her on all important adventures. Daddy, can we stop at the park on the way home? Of course. We should celebrate your new consulting position. As they rode the elevator down from the 38th floor, Sophie asked the question that had been building all morning. Are you happy with your new job, Daddy? Michael considered his answer carefully. I'm happy that I get to use my skills to help people in ways that make a real difference. And I'm happy that I can do meaningful work while still being present for everything that's important in your life. Sophie nodded seriously. So you don't have to choose between helping people and taking care of me. That's right. The best work is when you can do both. The park near their apartment building was busy with families enjoying the spring afternoon. Michael pushed Sophie on the swings while she chatted about her plans for the weekend and her excitement about the upcoming school science fair. The normalcy of the moment felt precious after months of significant change and new responsibilities. As they walked home, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but meaningful. Saw the news coverage of your program launch. Proud to have served with someone who continues to serve. Stay strong. Major Davidson, Kandahar, 2018. Michael smiled and showed the message to Sophie. Someone I used to work with in the army is proud of what we're doing now. Sophie read the message carefully. He says you're still serving. What does that mean? Michael thought about how to explain the concept of service to a 7-year-old. It means using whatever abilities you have to make life better for other people. It doesn't matter if you're wearing a uniform or a business suit or work clothes. What matters is that you're willing to help when help is needed. Not like when you carried me home that night during the flood and then went back to help all those other families. Michael stopped walking and knelt down to Sophie's eye level. Exactly like that. Sometimes the most important service is just being willing to carry people through difficult times. As they reached their apartment building, Michael noticed a familiar figure waiting by the entrance. David Carson, the businessman who had questioned Michael's competence during the water main emergency, stood nervously near the door with what appeared to be a gift basket. Mr. Chen, David approached them hesitantly. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to apologize for my behavior during the emergency and to congratulate you on your success with the new program. Sophie looked curiously between the two men, while Michael tried to place David's face in the context of that chaotic day months earlier. You were one of the fathers in the evacuation group, Michael remembered. You had concerns about the route we were taking. David nodded, looking embarrassed. I was scared and taking it out on you instead of trusting your expertise. I've been following the news coverage of your work with Meridian Industries, and I realized I completely misjudged your capabilities." Michael accepted the gift basket graciously. "You were protecting your family during a crisis. That's understandable. Still, I wanted to make amends. And I wanted to tell you that your leadership during that emergency inspired me to get more involved in community preparedness efforts. I've been volunteering with the Red Cross Disaster Response Team." Sophie tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Daddy, is this one of the people you helped get home that day?" Michael nodded. "He is. And now he's helping other people too." David smiled at Sophie. "Your father taught me that helping people isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to take responsibility and do whatever you can with the abilities you have." As David left, Michael and Sophie climbed the stairs to their apartment, which remained unchanged despite Michael's career transformation. Victoria had offered to help them find a larger place, but Michael had declined. Their small home represented stability and continuity for Sophie, values that were more important than additional space or prestigious addresses. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in their tiny kitchen, Sophie asked the question that had been building all day. "Daddy, do you think Mom would be proud of what you're doing now?" Michael paused in his chopping of vegetables, feeling the familiar pang that accompanied any mention of Sarah. "I think she would be proud that we're taking care of each other and helping our community." "That was always important to her." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "I think she would like Miss Victoria too. They both want to help people." As they sat down to eat, Michael reflected on the unexpected path that had led them to this moment. The job offer that had seemed like such a risk 6 months ago had proven to be exactly what he needed to fully utilize his capabilities while remaining the father Sophie deserved. The evening news featured a brief segment about the Regional Emergency Preparedness Initiative, including an interview with Victoria about Meridian Industries' commitment to community resilience. Michael watched with quiet satisfaction as the program he developed was described as a model for other cities facing similar infrastructure challenges. Sophie fell asleep that night with Mr. Peanuts tucked safely under her arm and her drawings from the day scattered across her pillow. Michael tucked her in gently, then sat by her bedside for a few minutes, listening to her peaceful breathing and reflecting on how much their lives had changed. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to navigate corporate politics, managing larger budgets, and coordinating with multiple agencies had required adjustments to his direct, military-trained approach to problem-solving. But the core mission remained the same, using his skills and experience to protect people and strengthen communities. As Michael prepared for bed himself, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that aligned with his values and utilized his full capabilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve his community, but tonight he could rest in the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The man who had once carried his sleeping daughter through flooded streets was now helping entire communities prepare for and respond to emergencies. The transformation was complete, but the mission remained unchanged, taking care of people who needed help, one crisis at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.